Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. As already said, I'm the director of the United Nations Forum on Forests. I'd like to just say briefly what that is. The United Nations Forum on Forests is a body under the United Nations, a commission of the UN, which addresses forest policy, all aspects, climate change, biodiversity, industry, medicine, you name it. If it relates to and impacts on forests and trees outside of forests, importantly, then the forum discusses it. And one of the speakers this morning said that, decisions or papers, conclusions by ministers or others are worthless. I'd love to have a long discussion with people about the fact that that is indeed not so. And I would like to set the stage for the speakers who are talking broadly on industrial scale issues to pick up a theme I heard this morning. And I applaud those who put together this session for thinking outside the box, for talking about how do we actually move ahead in a different way than we have before. How can we be successful at achieving what we have tried so long to do but have not been able to do? I've worked with non-governmental organizations, of which many of you are members, for many years. And one of the first areas I worked on globally was the Congo Basin Forest Partnership. But after that, the Forest Law Enforcement and Governance Ministerial, with I and John Hudson from the UK, came up with as a modality to address illegal logging. And it was interesting this morning that the speakers were talking about certification, but not about verifying legality, which for many developing countries can be the first step which they can really support in addressing the first step of issues, which is enforcing the laws of a country. And as a result of that, the Lacey Act in the United States and the FLEGT regulations in the EU have come in place, and they are only now starting to be implemented. At the heart of that is indeed the concept that one would work with industry, that instead of having an adversarial relationship, to get governments to commit to enforce their own laws, which then requires transparency of laws, which was also discussed this morning, and it also requires that industry which would like to see its product recognized, in this case in the European markets and in the US markets, need to be able to stand behind the chain of custody of the materials that go into their products. And we haven't begun to see the possible impact of that. But today, our speakers are talking about industrial scale agriculture, and I want to mention parenthetically that logging has perhaps the least impact on forests, and the biggest one is what you see up here. It's agriculture, for two reasons. One is the need for food security, and so increasing needs for food. Another is the consumption driver that was mentioned this morning, which is the increased use, say, of palm oil, and the drive for that, which is used throughout the food chain. And I think some work should be done on looking at, definitely looking at how we source from sustainably managed palm oil plantations, but at the same protecting those areas which are the last remaining areas which provide water. And pulp and paper, there has been a move in about the last 5 years, very much, to ask that, to source pulp and paper and ask large companies in particular to stop clearing natural standing forests for pulp and paper purposes. And so some large companies in Asia, for example, have started to make this commitment. Of course, the question then for Serge, who specializes in that region, would be, will they stand by it sustainably, or will in 20 or 30 years or something we see them reverting as things change and then reverting to their old practices? So the sustainability of these commitments is also important. And And frankly, NGOs dealing with forests, which are, of course, as you know, where 80% of the terrestrial habitat lives, NGOs have largely focused on timber and logging as being the issue. Again, I remind you that agriculture is by far the biggest threat, including in Africa, but less than in some other regions of the world. And so in the forest community, we have begun talking about the landscape. Rather than dealing in an isolated fashion with a sector, if you call forests a sector, I call them an ecosystem, plus they have a sectoral component, which is the industry, but dealing with forests is just part of the landscape. I know Jane Goodall has emphasized for years now that her work with chimpanzees showed her that you had to have corridors through which these could breed and keep the species alive and healthy. And that meant that you had to have a land plan, a land use plan. And how do we arrive at that kind of planning when we have worked in silos, both as activists, as industry, and as governments? We have worked in silos, and we continue to do so. But the forest community is committed at this time to start working with all sectors. And there's some arguments about that, because people feel, well, if you focus on forests, you'll get more attention for forests, it'll bring forth more. My body, the United Nations Forum on Forests, for which I am director, says no. We will never achieve the sustainability of that resource unless we start working with other sectors and other partners. That's much more challenging than you would think, as you've already heard implied this morning. I want to touch on one more thing, and I'd like the panel, if it could, to respond to this one issue. In 2 years, the post-2015 development agenda will be agreed, and along with it, sustainable development goals. This comes out of the Rio 20+20 process, which was started at the Earth Summit, and then in 1992, and then continued at the World Summit on Sustainable Development, and then finally at Rio +0. Governments at the highest level, heads of state, have agreed to integrate, they're starting to agree now to integrate this development agenda, which was previously known as Millennium Development Goals, to Sustainable Development Goals. Now here's my challenge for you. I know that there's an appetite for having biodiversity as one of those goals, and I applaud that. I think that's fine. But in forests as well, there's a lot of pressure to have a forest goal. Well, if the template is, and the appetite by governments is to only have a few, like there were last time, enabling much more public attention and visibility, then you have a lot of competition for those goals. Ambassador Amina Mohammed told me recently that she's had about 400, she's the special advisor to the Secretary General on the Millennium Development Goal process post-2015, and she said she has 462 goals proposed to her through an intergovernmental process worldwide. Our challenge is then, how do we take something like biodiversity, great apes, and more broadly biodiversity, but see it integrated? I'd like to pose to you, to the panel, it's in our interest to see issues like the one we're discussing today integrated, because poverty elimination, one of the goals that will undoubtedly continue, is very directly related, as has been discussed already this morning and is being discussed, I think, here, is very directly related to the remaining forests and habitat for wildlife, and jobs, livelihoods. I would like to urge this group of people, these scientists, to start to make available the data you talked about earlier today, and I'd like to hear from this panel, even if it's a postscript on your remarks. What do you see as relevance for your area of work to how would you want to see your issues integrated into this post-2015 development agenda? Because I assure you, money will follow, at least for 5 to 10 years. And so there's a way to bring all these things together that might catalyze true action in a different way. And integration, I believe, is it. So you're going to talk about industrial scale agriculture and presumably how it affects natural resources, including biodiversity and the habitats of those biodiversity. So I'd like to start with Inza Kone. Let me just tell you briefly about him. He's from the Swiss Center for Scientific Research, a lecturer at the Université Félix Houphouët-Boigny in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, and he is head of the Biodiversity and Food Security Department at the Centre Suisse de Recherche Scientifique en Côte d'Ivoire, Abidjan. And his research focuses on, wait for it, wildlife management, which links ecology, economics, and cultural and behavioral ecology. I already know that he agrees with me about the need for integration. Inza, please. 5 to 7 minutes.
I have to warn you, I'm from Ivory Coast, as she said, which means that I speak English and hear English like a francophone, even worse, like a African francophone. I have a few slides. This one is not very beautiful, but it states the decline that we observe in white population of chimpanzees in Côte d'Ivoire. In less than 20 years, I mean between 1990 and 2007, Côte d'Ivoire lost 90% of its white population of chimpanzees, which is catastrophic. There are several drivers to this. The main driver, naturally, is deforestation. Deforestation caused by several factors like urbanization. Côte d'Ivoire is a modern country with good road infrastructure, but this has impact on nature. Another driver would be the extractive industry, logging, mining. All these impact biodiversity through deforestation. And the most important one, the most important driver would be agriculture. Why? Simply because Côte d'Ivoire has built its development strategy on the development of agriculture. You can hear many reports or many documents stating that the success of this country is based on agriculture. As a result of this and of different strategies implemented by the government, including the creation of governmental agencies, yes, in charge with the development of different sectors like cocoa, coffee, rubber, we are ranking first as producer of cocoa, for instance. I think we have the first rank in the world. We are the first producer of coffee, and we are among the big producers of rubber and now palm oil. The development of this plantation, industrial plantation, most of the time, has rarely taken environmental aspect into account. And this can be demonstrated through what happened. Most forest areas have been converted into plantations. This slide shows different protected areas, not national parks or reserves, but what we call forest literally classified forests. This is a special category where timber exploitation is allowed, but under the control of a governmental agency called SODEFOR. You can see that in the country, we have more than 200 forests of this category, but only on paper today. Most of them have disappeared and replaced by large industrial plantation of cocoa, rubber, and especially oil palm. My focus here will be on oil palm. Today, if you take a picture or a satellite image of the biggest plantation of oil palm, you will see that they coincide with the forests that have disappeared today. So which means that protected areas have been converted into plantations. This is a very common picture if you travel across Côte d'Ivoire. Over hundreds of kilometers, you will find oil palm plantation, especially in eastern Côte d'Ivoire and also in western Côte d'Ivoire. I would say on coastal Côte d'Ivoire. This area has been, converted into oil palm plantation. Of course, we have other plantations like rubber and so on, but this is the dominating landscape that you will find in these areas. My experience with the oil palm industry dates back from 2008, when I was leading a community-based conservation project for the Tanwe Forest, located in the southeastern corner of Côte d'Ivoire, as you can see on this map, very close to Ghana. All around this forest, you can see, all around the forest, you have only plantation. I mean, oil palm plantation dominantly. Of course, by the time I was doing this project, there was no more chimps in this region because all of them had been hunted to extermination, or their habitat had been replaced by this oil palm plantation. So the only remaining forest, 12,000 hectares only, was the biggest forest area remaining in the southeastern corner of Ivory Coast, as you can see. My interest for this forest was about monkeys. This forest houses the most endangered free monkey species occurring in West Africa. And we've done several studies on the plant community and other animal communities, and we could find that this forest had at least 33 plant species of conservation concern, about 40 species of birds of conservation concern, and 10 species of amphibians of conservation concern. Nonetheless, an oil palm company wanted to replace this important forest by an oil palm plantation. And their argument was very simple. They argued that they had made an environmental and social impact assessment as stated by the Ivorian law, and that this forest had no value. They called it the mud. This is the word used by the neighboring communities, because the forest is swampy. So they said there is no conservation value regarding this forest, and so they could, create their plantation. But we demonstrated the contrary, and we met them and discussed. And you know what they said? They said, okay, anyway, we said we made our environmental impact assessment. There's no biodiversity importance for this forest. And anyway, you may complain where you want. We are the most important company in this country. We employ most of the employees in Côte d'Ivoire after the Ivorian government. So, and by this project, we'll be investing billions of dollars. We'll be creating thousands of jobs. We'll be constructing infrastructures like roads, like schools for these poor communities living in this area. So they were very sure of their business. But we believed in our capacity of communicating, of fighting, and we initiated, a national and international protest campaign to protect this forest. And we've been supported at all levels, including at the governmental level. That was surprising. They didn't believe in the beginning, but finally they followed us, and 1 year later the company stopped its activities there. That was, presented in the national and international media like a historical victory compared to the combat between David and Goliath that you know. But because it was really that.
2 minutes.
Okay. Why do I tell you this story? Their agricultural practices are also, confusing because not only they destroy the habitat, but they use practices like this, what draining, because I said this is a swampy forest that nobody could exploit, but they came with expertise from Malaysia and they could drain the forest. As you know, the consequence of draining a wetland, this is compared to a carbon bomb, but they didn't care. The picture is quite the same in all Africa, across Africa. Oil palm is having a new wave of expansion in Ghana, in Cameroon, in Liberia, in Nigeria, in Guinea, almost everywhere. And they are using the same techniques, arguing that they made environmental and social impact assessment and that there is no consequence in terms of biodiversity or impact on local communities, things like this. The same arguments are being used by all these people. Another fact is that most of these industrial companies know about certification processes, including the Roundtable on Sustainable Oil Palm. They are even members of this. The company I was talking about in Côte d'Ivoire was connected with Unilever at this time. So they know this principle, and they even have a department in charge of sustainable development. But these are just images that they want to display to people to continue their practices that are not definitely environmentally friendly. And this is the same picture across Africa. For this reason, I don't believe that currently we can really talk about sustainable coffee, maybe sustainable oil palm at least. We cannot talk about this at the moment. There are efforts. Roundtable is an effort. Other certification processes are effort and tools, but these are still too timid, too shy. We have to continue in this perspective. I think the reason for the limitation of their impact is that our altitude is market-driven. So we don't have to be influenced by market. We have to influence market. Yes. We have to do this transition with courage towards green economy. That's it. Thank you.
I'd just like to note for later that Côte d'Ivoire was also affected by conflict. And conflict can undo decades of commitment to protected areas and other approaches of sustainability. Once a country is overtaken, then all bets are off, as we say here. So the next speaker, let me just introduce her. Alexandra Saunders is President and Chief Executive Officer of Nuubia Chocolate, but she has also a very esteemed career. She's worked she is a scientist in energy, environment, and natural resources, studying at the University of California, Berkeley, and has worked with a variety of corporations to integrate biodiversity into their business practices. And she calls herself a serial social entrepreneur. I'm going to steal that phrase. And has a lot of management, business development, strategic marketing experience. So working with all these industry sectors, as you already heard her say when she asked a question this morning, has led her to strongly believe in a sustainable approach to working with her own products in her own company. And so she talks in her CV about engaging in no-harm capitalism. So we look forward to hearing from you about these issues. Thank you.
Well, I'm really honored to be here, and I have to say that if there are solutions for saving the great apes, it really is with this group of people. So I'm here not to promote my company or my products at all, but to really meet with you and find out what your concerns are, what your needs are, if there's anything that we can do or that I know that I can help, I want to do that. So, and I'm very emotional about this because I studied orangutans when I was young, and I care very deeply about orangutans. I care very deeply about the great apes, and I am very concerned for the fate of this planet. I created Nuubia about 3 years ago, and I created it out of a dream that I had when I left Berkeley, that there were solutions in private enterprise. Unlike many of my colleagues who went into scientific fields and also conservation, I chose to go into industry. And so my entire career I have spent trying to come up with some sustainable solutions for the companies that I've worked with. When I created Nuubia, I created it out of an idea that we would make products that would not harm the environment. And we would demonstrate to our industry that not only could we make a product that was beautiful and that consumers loved, but that in fact it could demonstrate that they too could follow in our path and integrate sustainability so that it became profitable for them. It actually was a profit center for them.
Inza just talked about the problems with verification of sustainability of cocoa, which of
Right.
course is your main ingredient.
Right.
Do you agree with him that it's very difficult to verify?
Absolutely. When I created Nuubia, you see some images, and these are just our chocolates that I'm showing you. But when we created Nuubia, I had created a company before that called Miragios, and Miragios was helping. It was out of Walmart's sustainability initiative, where the vendors needed to be vetted and they needed to have sustainable practices, and the agriculturalists in this country did not have the tools. And so we were creating those tools, and through that I learned about what Palm was doing to the orangutans. And so I left the company and I created Nuubia. And what I found is that when you create a product like fine chocolates, you have to be able to package them. So immediately...
So that's the packaging which you talked about
Yeah.
briefly this morning. But
Yeah.
how about the product itself?
The product itself,
Because the
so we had
cocoa-
to vet each one of our suppliers. And as an example, there's a wonderful Swiss chocolate company. They're chocolate makers. And we had to return product to them because we found out that in some of the products they were sending us that it had palm oil. And so we knew that we made a decision that we would not use palm oil. It was absolutely not
Right.
acceptable to us. But it also, in our products, we use 20 different ingredients, up to 20 different ingredients. And each one of those, we have to find the source and the origin
Yeah.
of where those ingredients are grown, the company that is, the company that contracts with the actual, with the smallholders that grow the products. And it's a continual process. It's constantly changing. So what I've found as the consumer of these products is that I have to engage my suppliers in a conversation, and often the suppliers are completely ignorant, totally ignorant about what the situation with the great apes. And they're really interested in making a sale. Bottom line is they're interested in making that sale to me, and if I start a conversation about biodiversity and the great apes, they'll listen politely. Some of them will be engaged, but most of them, they're oblivious to what is happening.
So one more question, then maybe we move on, but for later conversation, dialogue with the audience. But do you think your product experiences a premium price-wise because you
We do.
engage in these prices? Do you charge more for your
We
chocolates?
absolutely charge more.
And does it pay off?
Yes. So I have to back up for a moment and say that my chef is one of the leading chocolatiers in the world. And so he already has a reputation with chefs. And so
All right, so you're building on that platform.
So we're building on that. And the fact that he is expected to produce premium products. And so our market are other chefs who will pay a premium price for our products. Now, we're also introducing products for the Whole Foods of the world, the specialty markets of the world. And there we're price competitive. We have to be price competitive with other chocolatiers. and often our ingredients are much more expensive. But we have chosen to take a smaller margin because of our commitment to conservation. And this is where what you were saying is that it's not about the markets influencing conservation. Conservation needs to influence the markets. And so it's really critical that conservationists begin to engage the private sector so that the private sector is aware of what's at stake.
I'm also hearing a pattern here with the two speakers about the need for connecting to the whole chain of custody, back to the
Absolutely.
source, and understanding what's happening in that landscape, and also then educating the in-between people that handle the product.
Yes, yes. And
Thank you, Alexandra. So why don't we come back to you?
All right.
You're going to say one more thing?
I was going to say one thing.
Please.
Is when you leave, you'll be tasting one of our products that will be
Yay.
launched. And it's a fine chocolate from, the origin is, the cacao comes from Madagascar.
Which has a spotty history with sustainability, but yes.
And caramelized Rice Krispies and coffee. But what this is, our products, what happens, people often will eat our products and they'll say, oh my goodness, this is amazing. And that gives us the opening to have a conversation
Right,
about
right.
conservation.
Super. Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Now, George, I don't have a bio for you. So would you just give a quick, quick synopsis of what you've done in the past, where you are now at the World Bank? You work in the Africa region, I understand, which, by the way, if you don't know the World Bank, which is hugely influential because of the amount of lending it does, and also some investments for not-for-profits and others. It works very closely in partnership with NGOs and civil society. But a regional representative can have more influence than the one in Washington, or I've experienced that you have a lot of ability to influence some of the issues that have been addressed here.
It's not for want of trying. I've been at the World Bank full-time since 1990. Most of that time has been based in the Latin American Caribbean region, but the last 4 years I've been in the Africa region. I'm lead ecologist in the Africa region. And I should start by emphasizing that in this panel, what I'm talking about are my own views, not necessarily World Bank policy. If you want to know what World Bank policy is, just ask specifically and I'll try to answer it. They're not necessarily opposed, but they're not always the same. There's a spectrum of views among staff, as you might expect. I agreed that commercial agriculture, large-scale commercial agriculture, has a huge footprint in terms of biodiversity. It's one of the main drivers of loss of natural habitats, including the moist forests that harbor the remaining great apes. And so it's a huge challenge. It's a very major impact. And in the few minutes that I have to start out with, I want to focus on one part of it simply because it hasn't been mentioned so far, which is the biofuels market. Biofuels are a big driver for a lot of the large-scale commercial agriculture. Very roughly about half of the so-called large-scale land acquisitions going on in the Africa region are for biofuels. Now, in the drier areas, it may be jatropha, it may be for sugar cane, it may be for other crops. It's also for oil palm in the wetter areas where the great apes tend to be. And for those food crops like oil palm that are also used for biofuels, a significant fraction goes into the biofuels market. So if something could be done in terms of affecting that market, it could potentially have a big impact in reducing the pressures, because what you see from large-scale commercial agriculture is big chunks of land suddenly go from being natural habitat to being essentially a monoculture. And In the case of biofuels, large-scale cultivation of these crops is not biodiversity friendly, as we can see, but it's also, and some people are surprised by this, it's not climate friendly either, even though it's often touted as being so. First thing to remember is that biofuels are a carbon fuel, just like the fossil fuels that they're intended to replace. Biodiesel is carbon, just like petroleum diesel, and the emissions are roughly about the same when they're burned. But you say, well, but it's being made up when the plants are growing, but that's not necessarily the case, because the concept of an offset is, to be real, an offset has to be additional, and usually there's something else growing out there already that if you're suddenly cultivating oil palm or soya or sugar cane, something else was growing there first that was also absorbing carbon, in many cases more efficiently than the biofuel. So an accounting has to be done, but in general, they're not climate friendly very often, as was suggested in the slide shown on Côte d'Ivoire. They're replacing wetlands, areas that store a lot of carbon, or areas with a lot of peat or a lot of standing forests. So they're not typically climate friendly. So among the renewable energies, it sort of puts them in the lose-lose zone. If you think of being climate friendly and biodiversity friendly, if you think of things like hydroelectric power, solar, wind, geothermal, they have adverse impacts on biodiversity if they're not done well, but at least for the most part they're low carbon, except for some of the hydro plants that flood lots of forests. But most hydroelectric dams don't emit that much carbon. And so at least they're low carbon, but with the biofuels, they're usually not even low carbon, and they're harmful for biodiversity. So if there's a way of getting at that, that's...
I think you have an audience here who would agree with you.
Okay, I'll move on then.
So then the question is...
What to do about it,
yeah.
right. So I wanted, I've thought about what to do about it sort of in three categories. And the first one is sort of, well, put a fence around, figuratively, around the areas that you want to protect, play defense. And that's really important, and it means establishing some kind of protected area that at a minimum can legally stand up to an agricultural investor that wants to put in a new plantation. Unfortunately, those forest reserves in Côte d'Ivoire weren't able to, but if establishing new protected areas is really important for those areas that with great apes or other biodiversity that we're concerned about. And it may take a while to get them really consolidated on the ground, but if you at least get them on the map, then and if government agrees, then it's one area where these large-scale monocultures are not supposed to go. So that I think is an important strategy. Land use planning along those lines, very important, identifying the key areas and then making sure that it's enforced to the extent that the incompatible land uses like large-scale commercial agriculture don't move in. Second area is thinking about how to make commercial agriculture more biodiversity friendly. And with some crops like cacao, like coffee grown under shade, rice grown in wetlands, they can be more biodiversity friendly. Not necessarily that helpful for great apes because, and many of the people here know more about that than I do, but I tend to think of great apes as, well, at least chimpanzees like the same kind of food that people like. So if you're telling farmers to plant more shade trees or even plantation managers, you get into the realm of human-wildlife conflict. So, but certainly for other kinds of biodiversity, many species of birds and smaller creatures, having shade cacao, having shade coffee makes a big difference. One example, one of the projects I'm working with in Burundi is promoting shade coffee. Historically, all the coffee in Burundi has been grown in the sun because of what the colonial masters advised the farmers to do. But now we're encouraging shade, which has biodiversity benefits, but we're expecting it to be for birds and for smaller creatures. We have an activity to support chimpanzee conservation, but it's within a protected area of forest, and we're not expecting that the chimpanzees are going to live in the coffee areas. But anyway, in some cases it can be more biodiversity friendly, and then there are conservation offsets, which have had more traction with the extractive industry, which has really deep pockets than they have had with commercial agriculture. But I think there's a potential to get commercial agriculture more involved in that. I'm starting up work on a study on biodiversity offsets. I have a handout on it, which I left outside, and there's a session Tuesday on funding where I'm going to talk a little bit more about offsets. And so then the third and final point is just how to deal with in the case of biofuels, where especially biodiesel, such as comes from oil palm, there are subsidies, there are incentives that drive the market. And particularly in the European Union, and often they're driven by a notion that we think of as something very positive, a renewable energy standard or a renewable fuel standard. But I would suggest tweaking that and calling it instead a low carbon fuel standard, because then you're putting attention on the low carbon renewables, but not on the biofuels as a solution. And I think that one change, for example, if I'm not terribly optimistic, but if the post-2015 agenda, instead of talking about a renewable energy standard, talked about a low carbon energy standard, making it clear that usually biofuels don't cut it, that could make a huge difference.
Thank you.
Including for the great apes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, George. I will want to have you at some point answer the following question. For many years, about 20 years, the World Bank would not have any robust forest programs because of what Umalele coined as the chilling effect of dealing with forests. That was the non-governmental organizations being against the World Bank dealing with the forests because of industry. However, simultaneous with that, the increase of funding going to agriculture, which ended up deforesting, was enormous. So one question I will have for you to think about is there an ability in the World Bank to influence agriculture practice so it integrates sustainability? I know my friend Rachel Kite, who's vice president of the World Bank, certainly is trying to integrate, and the World Bank reform is trying to do this. But how successful do you think that is? Is that helping you in the kind of objective you have? We'll come back. Serge, I also would love to have a bio for you, but I don't. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, I'm a scientist. I'm a primatologist. I studied orangutans for about 20 years in Southeast Asia. And I was asked at 6 o'clock this morning if I could join this panel. So
perfect. That's why I don't have a bio.
That's why I have a few slides.
What? You had lunchtime to write one.
Inza, could you pass that? Yeah, so I had a bit of time to think about this. So forgive me for having a few slides about this. This is a picture from a drone of oil palm areas. I just had to say that and put a picture in because I was mentioned there as conservation drones. So, but I'm also at a university, so therefore a drone picture of oil palm in Malaysia.
And I know he's Dutch, but he lives in Liverpool, and he worked in Asia. So,
yes,
right?
And I still try to hide my Scouse accent and speak proper English. People have said this already a few times. Tropical forests are being replaced by agriculture. It's sort of the primary area where agriculture gets its land from. And that's the same for oil palm, which we're going to focus on a little bit. I put this slide in because I started to go to Tripa in 1992, which is that area that you see. It's in the orangutan habitat. It's up there in the first frame, 1990, where it was almost completely forested. And then in my career working there, it almost exclusively became oil palm. So things go very, very rapidly. The red stuff is oil palm. So things move quickly. So there's it's very important to try to address this issue quickly because it goes so fast. What it does, of course, is that you get these monocultures. We've seen that already. And those are basically areas in which all biodiversity goes, and it also does not come back. So there's not, like with the extractive industry, a restoration aspect to this. These areas are devoid of orangutans, and they will also not return. They're devoid of chimpanzees, and they will very likely not return. So this is very, very different. You really lose animals, and they won't come back. So what are the things that need to be done, at least to try to get to this sustainable agriculture, which is very difficult to define and which we don't really all feel terribly comfortable with, because we know that with large-scale industry, sustainable is very difficult because you lose all these areas in which there was a lot of biodiversity. So for instance, on this map, this is the orangutan distribution in Borneo. And as I said this morning, killing of orangutans is illegal by Indonesian law. Nevertheless, about 19% of the orangutan habitat has been allocated to oil palm concessions, and orangutans in those areas will die. I mean, that's the reality of it. Whether this is a trade-off or not, we'll lose these animals, and it's against the law. But proper land use planning should ideally take place so that you don't put development in these areas, but that you try to steer it to these areas. In Sumatra, for instance, there is enough degraded or low biodiversity, low carbon land for all the oil palm growth projected for the coming 15 years. There's 1 million hectares of that land there, but the institutional and logistic framework to use that land and the financial institutions backing those investments instead of large-scale agriculture and even larger areas is not there. So it's not happening as much as we would like to, but the opportunity is certainly there, and I think it's something that we could all do much more work on. Well, this is just what I tried to say already. So should you convert areas where there are apes, even when it's against the law? I think it's just something to really, really think hard about. If you develop areas with oil palm and there are things like the RSPO or alternatives for it, and we want to enforce or improve upon RSPO or other frameworks, we all know that enforcement and transparency are important. And this is just another drone picture to show that you can fly over these oil palm areas and you could map them on a very regular basis and put these maps online where people can see, are they sticking to the rules? Are the riverine forests still there? Are the corridors still there? Are they encroaching upon other lands or not? So the tools are there to do this. So we should, I think, try to do this with a combination ground truthing, satellites, drones, whatever techniques we have to do this, so that to have the chain of custody, that we know that this comes from a plantation that is really trying to stick to some of the guidelines. So let's try to do this. Let's try to encourage industry to allow this to happen. Ban, I think, conversion of oil palm development on peatlands. It's also, in most cases, against the legislation in many countries. It's not good for the environment, and it should just really not happen because it doesn't serve a good function. And these peatlands will probably be underwater in 20 years because of the drainage and the subsistence of all the lands. So it's not a long-term development anyway. Increase the productivity of oil palm plantations. Been often been said, but is that really good? If you think about it, if you increase the value of agricultural land, it also means that if you want to have a forest, and we have to have the economic thinking and think about payment for ecosystem services, those values need to go up as well to remain competitive. So this is an issue in which there's been very little research yet, but it's something to seriously think about, because it might not lead to the outcomes that we really want to. So some further things that have been said already. There should, of course, be no hunting in these plantations or killing of apes. Other thing is consumer awareness. Let's try to develop smart things to develop awareness and make sure that consumers are willing to pay the premium. There are oil palm companies out there that are growers out there that are complaining that they're doing everything according to the sustainability guidelines, but that are not getting the premium. So they're rethinking their sustainability practices. And then there's the other big thing, which is oil palm's homecoming, as I call it. Oil palm comes from Africa. It's just a mapping exercise that we finished a couple of days ago. The dark pink areas are where oil palm suitability overlaps with great ape habitat. So this is huge, and this is a big issue. So to then end with a few maybe thought-provoking questions. Maybe, well, I assume everybody knows that oil palm is the most productive vegetable oil per surface area, 4 times as productive as soy. Should we look into replacing soy, which is also not very biodiversity rich, with oil palm? I don't know of any study that addressed that. I don't know the numbers. But if there's soy, why not replace it by oil palm if people want to have a vegetable oil and don't care too much about soy or oil palm? Some people might, some people might not. That might at least increase the vegetable output per surface land in which we don't have much biodiversity already. The same for farmland that might not be very productive and where you could do this without having a negative impact on farmers or food production. And what about synthetic oil? Is this something that if somebody would invent it and it would be edible, would people actually accept this? And could it be done at this kind of scale? Should people be more involved in trying to develop this? Should we push that more? Do we know what consumers want? I don't know. I mean, I don't find it particularly appetizing to think about it. I prefer olive oil or something, but of course, it might have some impact if we try to do that. I don't think technology is the answer to everything, of course, but maybe it can help with reducing the footprint we have on the planet somehow. So I think those
Thank
are my
you.
thoughts.
Thank you. Well, this whole panel deserves some applause right now, yes? And what I'd like to say is I noticed that there was positive in all of these comments. People were looking towards and pointing you towards where there were solutions. In the case of Côte d'Ivoire, Inza underlined the fact that he was able, with other colleagues, to save an area of pristine forest from palm oil plantation. It was unprecedented. It was viewed as historic in the country. So it's not an impossible task. Alexandra is talking about an experience in an industry where she has taken on the role of working with suppliers to educate them about the sources and emphasizing the chain of custody. That education process is critical, and of course she's taken into account the premium, and the premium is not always there. Serge underscored maybe the consumers could pay for premium, but how you do that is truly still a challenge. And maybe it does take, as somebody said earlier, industry to take the responsibility for driving that message through. George talked about some very innovative thinking about working with looking at biodiversity-rich areas and the relationship to agriculture and figuring out how he might, in his position, influence that. And of course, Serge has come up with some very fascinating suggestions for ways in which this could be positive. And so what I'd like to have the audience do, if you could, to the extent that you find it in yourself, is to phrase or make suggestions to the panelists that are ways to build on what they've proposed, the ideas that they've given you. And so I'd like to turn it over now to the audience and ask for questions and comments.
Thanks, Ian Singleton, Sumatran Orangutan Conservation Programme. I just wanted to draw a parallel to the talk this morning from Barbara about the fact that when major development projects, mines or World Bank road building projects, etc., it's often like they're not proactive in finding out what's already there on the land they're about to destroy. And I think the excuse is gone nowadays. Nowadays, 10 years ago, nobody had the remote sensing data, nobody had good maps of ape distribution. It's not the case anymore. So what I think we need to come out of this meeting with is some commitment from major development organizations, major industries, that they will contact the people with the knowledge, not 5 years down the road after they've spent $15 million, but at the very beginning of the project. And they won't just go to governments and be fobbed off with misinformation. They will actually actively seek out the information they require.
I did hear some remarks on the panel about the inadequacy of the environmental impact assessments that industry was using, and that maybe we need to retool those. And then packaged with the idea you had about introducing GPS and other forms of ground truthing to make this more realistic, and then, as Barbara suggested, doing it at the very upfront point in the cycle could make a real change. And then I'd just like to add, influence the post-2015 development agenda and sustainable development goals, which, by the way, will have targets and indicators. And indicators require that you have baseline information. And so I think there's going to be increasing pressure on governments to live up to their commitments, and there are going to be targets which will be percentage of hectare of forest, for example, or species protected, and then there will be indicators of whether or not that succeeded. So I think if governments agree to that, those indicators and targets, there will be increased pressure by governments around the world and by donors to make them live up to those. And so that's a real opportunity. More comments and questions, don't be shy.
Dave Morgan from the Gulago Ape Project in Northern Republic of Congo, and I could see, with the map in Africa, we do have serious issues coming in the Congo Basin with oil palm. I know in the north of Congo, we're going to have in the next 5 to 6 years the largest oil palm plantation in Central Africa, not perhaps even all of Africa. It's going to dramatically change this landscape. It already is, and there's nobody really looking at that impact. But I was wondering, because they're importing all of these people into these regions, these companies, it's amazing. These companies bring in 600, 1,000 people into these remote areas. They build cities. And I'm wondering why they're not being held to feeding these people. Right now, they're living off of bushmeat. But you can imagine in 5 years, when that area where that oil palm is, they've estimated up to 18,000 people are going to be living in that area. And they're not going to have any food to eat. The bushmeat is going to be gone. And it's right next door to one of the largest populations of gorillas in the world, the Ozala National Park. And so with the same we talk about with logging companies, forcing them to get involved in feeding the people that they're importing into these areas. Livestock, chickens, right now it seems to be left up to NGOs looking at those type of aspects.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And of course, we've long known that an intrusion into a forest can create a domino effect on other issues.
Just the general public doesn't know a lot about palm oil, because if you're concerned about primates, you know about palm oil because you understand Borneo and Sumatra. So my question to you, when you were talking about the degraded areas that could be used to grow these plantations, why is it that they choose, I didn't understand quite why it is they choose the more pristine areas to destroy rather than use areas that wouldn't be as detrimental? And what can we do to raise hell, popularize, and I love that drones are being used for something good instead of killing people, but.
Serge, I think that one was primarily directed to you.
Often, the larger a plantation is, the more economy of scales there is for a company. They can build a mill next to it, they can have their supply lines going only to one area, so it's logistically easier and more feasible for them. On the other aspect is that if there's a forest that you can log, the profit from logging that forest is part of the investment capital to start the company, to the oil palm. So those two factors are very important. So what needs to happen is that there are financial incentives for companies that want to start these oil palm plantations in smaller areas, because these degraded areas are smaller, and that there's investment capital to do so, and that the logistical framework to achieve that is there by and sort of help by the government and by the financial institutions.
So let me just say, however, George pointed out that palm oil is a monoculture, and that it has, and you know, it has real problems for biodiversity. Of course, the fact that these areas are degraded already, you could say, well, they're fallow or whatever, but those fallow areas often have their own types of biodiversity, regardless. In fact, the Global Partnership on Forest Landscape Restoration, of which UNFF is a member, has estimated there are 2 billion hectare worldwide of degraded areas that could potentially be used for something along the lines what you're suggesting. But I'd like to ask the panel, what do you think about that idea that shifting palm oil away from taking down pristine forests, do you see any unintended consequences about suggesting they use degraded lands? And the second question is it really true that there's no possibility of intensification of palm oil agriculture production, so that using the existing land gives you the possibility to do more work? Inza, you want to say something on this?
Yeah, before coming back to your question, I would like to add something to what
Serge
answered to this question about why do they tend to spread pristine forest instead of degraded areas, for instance. I support what Serge said. I confund you with Chris. Yeah, so I support what Serge said, but I would add that another reason is that they don't take the real measure of their social responsibility. I mean, oil palm industry, for instance. They would prefer to, exploit a pristine forest because there's no clear ownership on this forest, for instance, instead of going to degraded areas that belong to communities, because then they would have to pay something to communities, or they would be forced to pay the products coming from the communities, but they don't want that. And it's easy for them to be, helping a few communities and having the majority of their plantation created, upon pristine forest, and then say, look at the owners. We are supporting communities. We have done environmental impact assessments. We have done social assessment, things like this. We even have RSPO certificates, for instance. But how has these certificates been obtained? The criteria are very clear. I don't doubt this, but what is doubtful is, the transparency in the process of delivering this certificate, RSPO or whatever. The certification process itself has to be controlled, has to be clear. There should be traceability at all levels, going from the production to the processing. But this is not always the case because, auditors, for instance, or certificate agents would have a very short time to make their assessment. And most of their assessments are based on the document produced by.
So I think you're drifting slightly, although I understand your passion.
Yeah.
I think we could all go on talking for a long time. I wanted to ask George if you have something on this.
On this question of going onto degraded lands, you want to go onto the areas that are of least conservation value. Usually those are the areas that are not primary forest, but in some places like the eastern United States, early successional habitats are actually more of conservation concern than mature forests. But certainly in the context of Central Africa, you want to maintain the native forests that still have lots of wildlife in them, and to put the agriculture in areas that have already been affected by humans. Now, why don't the companies want to go there? As was mentioned, it's areas that are, quote, degraded or intervened are areas that have people on them, and it's easier to go to an area that's a blank spot on the map where you don't have conflicting land claims. It just reduces the transaction cost. It's an easy way out, and it's not just in developing countries. In the United States, I grew up in Southern California. There's a lot of pressure on desert ecosystems from large-scale solar farms. Why do the solar developers target pristine desert? Because it's one land holding, typically government Bureau of Land Management land, rather than a whole bunch of small parcels that have to be consolidated from private landowners, which is where the degraded land is. So, and the solution, I think, is get the forest off limits, get the forest protected as much as possible. That will force the commercial agriculture to deal with people and on terms that presumably will make them better off as well.
Commercial scale. The big problem is that there are too many indigenous communities that live in and around forests. And if the balance is kept, so the population concerns raised earlier are going to have big impacts. It does sound to me that there needs to be a more strategic thinking on a landscape level of how to make decisions and which priorities should be first.
And that's another, on that point, a key consideration with large-scale commercial agriculture investments is they should be labor absorbing, not labor expelling. So if they go into an area and they force the people out, the people are going to go somewhere else and cut down the forest, and so there'll be a displaced impact. If, on the other hand, they can create employment for those people that are there already, perhaps also bringing in additional people, then you don't have that same displacement effect.
I hear palm oil, actually, once palm oil plantation is there, doesn't have many jobs.
About 2 years ago, I wrote a paper on the use of unmanned aerial vehicles, which we try not to use the word drones, but their use in animal conservation. And in that paper, I documented at least a dozen situations on 5 continents where the technology was being employed. Since that paper, we as a global community have begun to use them in South Africa to try and interdict the over 600 deaths in 2012 of the rhinos. These wonderful creatures that I've had the opportunity to be with are highly concentrated in one country. The threats are primarily, not exclusively, in one country. And Indonesia may or may not be willing to grant the permits needed to fly UAVs, even if the cost issues are dealt with and there's a sponsor to pursue that. So my question is, what is the opportunity for firming up the actual usage of land, not necessarily the legal usage of land? Second, the census taking of these creatures. And third, the interdiction of the poachers who threaten these creatures as well as land uses.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Tony Mudakikwa. I work for the Park Authority of the National Park in Rwanda. The question I'm going to ask is not related to the fact that I'm now coming from Rwanda, because at that time I was living in DR Congo, where I was born and grew up. But later on, when I went in Rwanda, I read that, and this is a question to George, when an institution pushed to make a mistake, and then 50 years later, we found out that there was a mistake made by the government, but under an advice or pressure from an institution who will be paying. I'm giving you an example. Or in the early 60s, when the price of paratrium was going very high, and the World Bank wanted to help a developing country like Rwanda. They suggest and advise Rwanda, you have a very fertile soil in the northwestern, on the Virunga volcano mountain, take a bunch of this land and put it in a paratrium. It went well until the late 60s, early 70s, when the paratrium price went down. But 15 years later, or already 30 years later, with the booming of a population in Rwanda and the high density that we all know, we have been trying to have a few land around the park. The gorilla population is trying to go up.
Brother, big sister.
And the problem now is that, people have been now really stuck between wrong advice or wrong decision that have made almost 80 years later.
So where are you going with this? So
I want to know, when there's been such kind of a mistake from an institution, who will be paying? The decision we are making now we want to do now on the same case.
Are you talking about recourse? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, so financial recourse?
Yes.
Okay.
I was excited to hear how much the World Bank's policies have changed, particularly since the example that Tony just illustrated. But if the Malaysian Palm Oil Council were on the panel, they would be telling us what a high proportion of their palm oil comes from small producers, from small growers, and how many families have benefited from the bonanza of increasing palm oil production because they've converted their own land into growing palm oil. On the other hand, last year I was in Sumatra, outside the remit of the Malaysian palm oil, and was learning from people who were pointing out the area of now large-scale plantation that they used to farm themselves, and which was taken without their permission, and they were pushed off the land. So that there's this constant PR presentation by the palm oil industry that they're good for development and good for family incomes.
Okay, so what are you suggesting we do about those bad
The reality
guys?
is that the economies of scale mean that large plantations are cheaper to set up and that nothing survives. And I applaud Inza's success in protecting that bit of forest, but 10 years down the line, you're going to have to probably fight that battle again and again.
Well, then it sounds like we should be pushing for more policy to support small and medium-sized enterprise.
I think Serge is right, that if there is agricultural land, let's have it grow palm oil, because it has a higher productivity than any other oil. So
Look at
we, the
alternatives.
Ape Alliance Palm Oil Working Group, are not anti-palm oil, we're anti-deforestation.
Right.
So it's pushing that idea that it's
Yeah.
not the palm oil that's bad,
Thank
it's
you.
the replacement of forests.
Thank you, Ian. Great. Well, I'm going to have each person say something brief. We have about 12 minutes left, and then, if I'm counting correctly, and I know I have a slew of people who want to talk, but so let's just take a few minutes each to respond to any one of these questions that you wish, but not too long.
Yeah, I'll try to be short. I had a question about communication between conservationists and the industry. I think this is really important. It doesn't have to be always a conflict situation. We can talk to each other, we can try to understand each other, and that's the way conservation can certainly positively impact market, and this is really important. Somebody has talked about putting people in touch with those who have knowledge. It's important, but we have to have this knowledge indeed, but it's not always the case. I talked about this combat for the Tanwe forest, but many other forests have been destroyed because there was nobody to highlight their conservation value. So we have to encourage research, education, and so on.
Yeah.
Any ideas that this generated for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Serge was talking about financial incentives for denuded land, which is very important for any for the economics of doing any kind of agricultural development. I think one of the things that's incumbent upon industry and trade is that each company, within that company, that there are people that will create conservation initiatives, and that the company commits dollars to those conservation initiatives. And there are, for example, if you look at palm oil, Cargill is a private company, and billions of dollars, and they supply the General Mills example, and we eat their cereal. Everybody eats General Mills cereal, which means we all eat palm oil, and if we're not looking at the labels. And so it's really incumbent upon the industries that are in the supply chain to create their own conservation initiatives and address.
Well, to some
these
extent, the
issues.
difficulty with that is it sometimes becomes greenwash, you know. But leaving that aside,
Absolutely.
you know, one has
Yeah.
to look at, if we could integrate that idea into more integrated approaches, such as those we've been talking about, that would be, you know, maybe we need to think about it more aggressively. And so yes, they should have somebody who looks at conservation, but also livelihood, social issues, and others as well. George?
Yeah, just a few points. First, following up on what we've just been talking about, when an agricultural enterprise or even an extractive industry comes into an area, they're sort of, I have these sort of three standard, minimum requirements in my head, which are not the same as the World Bank or IFC requirements or various standards that are out there, but a lot of overlap. But one is to avoid the most important areas, ideally avoid natural habitats entirely, but at least avoid the most valuable ones. To the extent they can't be avoided, have offsets that are real and independently verified. And we're trying to promote that more, to get governments involved, because at least with extractive industries, some of them want to do it, conservation NGOs want to see it done, governments sometimes don't facilitate things and make it more difficult, and so there's this study underway that where we're trying to see if that can be facilitated more. And third is just good practices. Like when I heard the story about the workers being encouraged, if not required, to eat bushmeat. I mean, that's definitely not the way to go. Certainly in anything that World Bank or IFC finances, that shouldn't happen. I'm not saying it never does, but it's certainly
I've
not
never heard of a
supposed to.
policy of
But,
the World Bank requiring that food product be included in such an agricultural.
The natural
Has it?
habitats policy prohibits those, and even the environmental impact assessment policy leads to an environmental management plan that shouldn't have that kind of thing. All the food should be brought in for the workers. They should be fired if they're eating bushmeat, not encouraged.
Okay, so
so that's, I mean, that's, but that's.
So does the World
private
Bank
sector
require
does
that now?
Sorry, what?
Does the World Bank require that now? I'm just curious. I've
Absolutely.
never heard.
I think where you get these is with private enterprises where it's the path of least resistance for them and there isn't adequate government oversight.
Right.
But
okay.
certainly World Bank and IFC policies wouldn't permit it. I can get into the details
Yeah, no, it's okay.
offline, but certainly.
Right. The
And-
question Tony asked about compensation.
About legacy issues,
Yes,
dealing with
the
legacy
Belgians
issues.
and pyrethrum.
Development's a learning process, so mistakes get made. In some cases, governments with World Bank support, because these are government projects where the bank supports them, try to undo damage that was done previously, whether it was a certain kind of water infrastructure that had the wrong results, where there's rehabilitation work to make it function better. And in some cases, if people in the past were resettled in a bad way, with or without previous World Bank involvement, there may be a component to try to, a community development component to try to include it. But so there are efforts like that. I mean, the kinds of, even I wasn't at the World Bank back, but no.
But I was in Burundi
all the
and
time,
Rwanda
and it's
when that happened.
of how to fix them once.
Okay.
But the first step is recognizing that it was a
Thank you.
mistake.
About the Malaysian part and the smallholders, well, I mean, this was industrial scale, so I didn't really focus or thought much about the smallholders. But yeah, I think they're somewhat being swamped out by the large-scale agriculture. And I think they also, there's a chain of custody problem there as well. I think even if a smallholder would, let's say you're a small farmer and you have a piece of degraded land and you would grow oil palm and you would like to provide that to a sustainable oil palm buyer that would market that as a product with sustainable oil palm in it. It becomes really difficult because of the large-scale mills where everything goes to, and then later on in Singapore it might get mixed with other palm oil again. So then you lose that whole path. So that I think is an issue that needs to be resolved. for more consumer pressure on companies on the producing and buying end as well. So that's, I think, something that we all need to try to work on and push people that can do those things on. And the other big thing is indeed land use planning. We have to figure out who owns land and what the rights of those people are. And this is a hard and painful process at many different levels, but I do think conservation organizations, and many of course do, need to be with the government when they plan these things. The big extractive industry does this as well. In Aceh, they're very actively involved in land use planning and changing the land use spatial plans for Aceh, and they even publicize that they got areas that were forested now off they have these areas now accessible for mining. So these companies are doing that, and we should try to be there when that happens and try to
Integrated
make sure
approach.
That, yeah.
Well, the good news is worldwide there's been an increase in Rights and Resources just put out a report last week that there's been an increase of community-owned forests of 35%. And this is a model that hasn't been much used in Central Africa, although the Baka have, I think, pushed for having more rights in those regions. And so maybe in Central Africa, one idea is to support and push for more engagement of the communities that live in and around forests. Well, I'd like to give 1 minute for everybody to quickly, and it'll have to be one, maybe less, because to say one last brilliant thought about the future. What do you still have hope? Yes or no?
Yes.
Good.
That's why I'm here.
Good. George?
Absolutely. I think it's a requirement to work in the conservation area to be an optimist. Just one final point about the post-2015 agenda. There have been internal discussions in the World Bank. I've participated, but I don't know how they've come out at the higher levels. People like your friend Rachel Kite would probably know. But my personal preference is that biodiversity should be explicitly there. Forest is not enough of a surrogate for biodiversity.
It's not a surrogate.
And it's important. You know, I think of biodiversity as a global crisis. It should be, receive attention comparable to climate change.
Thank you.
And it needs to be part of the post-2015 agenda.
Agreed.
Well, I'm of course also always hopeful, but I think one of the things that I would love to see solved is, I think intrinsically everybody would like to conserve biodiversity. Most people on the planet. The problem is how to get them to do it, and I think we're failing in many of those ways because we don't understand the psychology of a lot of people. We don't collaborate enough with people
or companies.
With companies, but also social scientists that know how do we influence buyers. I don't know. I'm not a specialist in that, but I think we need.
So
you're
hopeful, though.
I'm hopeful, but we do need to integrate everything we can. How do we influence consumers? And we need to work on that as conservation organizations and work with those people, because if we're not going to do that, then we'll lose. Right.
Well, I think that one thing is that biodiversity should not be just biodiversity by itself, but it has many more benefits than that word connotes to people. And so one thing is, in this new evolution of the post-2015 development agenda, we should start to recognize that and integrate biodiversity across other areas. Thank you. You've been a great audience. And I believe my time is up, our time is up. And I'm sure these folks are willing to talk to you. I know we had many other people who wanted to speak, and I'm sorry we couldn't fit you in, but it was a fun session for me. Thank you to the panelists for their great experience and advice. And I'm glad you're still optimists.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jan, and thank you to the panelists for this discussion, which should be the beginning of many more discussions. And just to add something that Serge was touching on briefly there at the end, how you change attitudes, how you change social behavior. There are many companies that do this. McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Levi's, they change attitudes every day on a scale we can't even begin to imagine, but for perspective, To purchase a single one-page, full-page advertisement in the New York Times for one day is $250,000. That's what it costs to begin to change attitudes. And that is more than any of us have ever spent on an ad campaign or a thought campaign in this world. We have to step up to a much, much higher level.